used to people describing me as disabled. Fair enough, I can't see. But I do wonder sometimes whether putting me into a disabled category really makes much sense. Some of my best friends use wheelchairs, but the truth is that our needs could hardly be more different. I fall over them, they run over me. But over the last 40 years, disabled people, and what other term can I use, have needed a collective identity to make change possible, to break down discrimination in jobs, in transport, in attitudes generally. People have tended to think that this sense of collective identity in Britain began after the First World War, when so many men returned with very visible injuries. But the evidence historians are now uncovering reveals it to have begun much earlier. And today, in this last programme in the series, we hear voices from the 19th century which we would describe as very modern. Here, for instance, is a blind woman writing in the 1820s. But this is something I would have been perfectly happy to have written yesterday.
One looks upon the loss of sight as one of the greatest misfortunes. I cannot share this opinion. I was deprived of my sight at the age of 9 months. I've just reached my 22nd year, and I still don't remember I ever formed a single regret concerning the loss of my eyes. If anything, it's the sad exclamations of people who see me that makes me unhappy. What a shame! How unfortunate! Death would be preferable to such a cruel privation. There are even some people who seek out the blind to tell them these things so they don't miss any of the sad exclamations.
How irritatingly true that still is. People still come up to me at parties and say, "How terrible it must be for you." That trenchant account of how blind people are seen was written by Adèle Husson, a blind woman living in post-revolutionary Paris. It was discovered only recently in the archives of the institution she was applying to live in, the prestigious 15-20. It wasn't that easy to find somewhere safe to live as a young blind woman in Paris. I was introduced to Adèle by Selina Mills, who's writing a history of blindness and is herself losing her sight.
I love her. When I found her, I almost yelled in the library because I just thought, my gosh, out of the blue, you've got this voice from 1825 telling you, actually, look, we don't like being mythologized, we don't like being stereotyped. And she's a woman as well. So in a time where women have very little power, very little influence, you've got this woman going, well, this is how my children shall be educated and this is what blind people are going to do. And she's so dynamic. I mean, she's very contradictory, very opinionated. I'd love to have met her. I bet she was very difficult.
And this is a very young blind woman telling probably mainly a load of...
She's 22. She's 22.
Older blokes, sighted blokes mainly, because they'd have been men, wouldn't they? How to treat blind people.
Yes, she's 22. She's writing to a director who's going to decide her fate. Can she stay in this institution or not? And it turns out that afterwards she writes novels for children and romantic sort of love novels, love romances.
And it is also very robust about, for example, the education of blind children. I mean, she says you should teach them how to dress themselves. They'll be able to do it OK. Don't patronise them. And she says things like, if they're bad, then you should punish them.
Blind children must be forced to dress and undress themselves on their own, something that for them might at first seem difficult, but later they will end up getting used to it, and it will greatly reduce their state of dependence. Their parents shouldn't speak of the misfortune linked to their situation either, for if they know they are pitied, they will become demanding, convinced that no one will refuse them anything they ask for, and every moment they will have new whims that would be difficult and even impossible to satisfy. Rather than caving into them, one should punish them as frequently as they deserve.
Adèle Husson was not alone. On the other side of the channel, another articulate, well-educated woman, Hippolyte van Lundegem, living in South London, was making her name as an articulate spokesman for disabled people. In fact, she was making a living as well by publishing a kind of samizdat literature, railing against institutions and charities for the blind and calling for better civil rights. This is the extraordinarily long and angry title of one of her works.
Charity Misapplied. When restored to society, after having been immured for several years in exile schools, where they are supposed to be educated, the blind and the deaf and dumb are found to be incapable of self-support. Hence they often become street mendicants or inmates of workhouses. Why? London, 1864.
Hippolyte's diatribe, and what we know of her life, is being uncovered now by the academic advisor to our series, David Turner of Swansea University.
It's really, really interesting how she rails against the practice of sending blind children away from their families to what she calls exile schools.
I mean, that's an interesting term in itself, isn't it? It's a pejorative term. She clearly doesn't like the concept, let alone what they were like.
No, I mean, she is very concerned about the effects of these institutions as dumping grounds.
The four-sensed are lost to the world, and what is worse, to themselves. For all aim is gone. There is no life purpose, no ambition. They have very little food for thought. The smallest modicum of intelligence is made to suffice in providing them with employments, and on all matters on which men possessed of five senses are allowed to hold free opinion, they are generally considered incapable of opinion. With the 1,000 proofs of high capacity in the four-sensed, which any person of moderate knowledge may call to mind, the wheel revolves in a groove, and pity keeps it there.
She uses a very interesting term. She talks about the four-sensed, obviously referring, to the five senses and one lost. But that is quite an interesting way of talking about a group of disabled people, isn't it?
It is, because it also implies that she's not just talking about blind people like herself, but she's co-opting deaf people as well in that to create a disabled identity based on a shared experience of impairment, something which is clearly very, very much ahead of its time. It's an idea that we tend to associate with the emergence of the disability rights movement in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, and also what's interesting, she's using it in a very positive sense, with the idea that maybe the four-sensed know a thing or two that the five-sensed don't, isn't she?
Yes, I mean, certainly in the field of education that she's most interested in. I mean, she makes a very forceful case that blind and deaf people ought to be listened to when it comes to the provision of special education.
So really it's a precursor of nothing about us without us.
Very much so, yes.
But these are still individual instances of disabled people writing about the things which upset them. When do we begin to see them banding together to drive political action? Julie Anderson of the University of Kent.
For a very long time throughout the 19th century, there were a lot of workshops for blind people, mainly blind men, and they made things like brushes, baskets. They were very poorly paid, and these workshops were very badly managed. So starting in 1897, the group gets together, and it is a very small group, but they are very militant. So they register themselves as a trade union in 1899, and then they become affiliated with the Trades Union Congress in 1902 and also the Labour Party. So they become a very militant trade union movement, essentially, which is wholly and solely concerned with issues surrounding blind people's work.
So can we see this as the start of disabled people acting together in a quite political way?
This is what is so interesting about the National League of the Blind, is they're actually working not just towards, sort of working conditions, but working together as a group. And if you paid your subscription of a penny a week, so it was quite inexpensive, you were supported if you were in an accident. You're supported if you died at work. And also they have an interesting area. You were supported if you were victimised at work.
So it's the beginning of the idea of discrimination.
Absolutely.
And this is very interesting because I think those people who do know about this, they still think that it probably started mainly after the First World War and in the early 20s when there was a lot of industrial unrest. But what you're saying is it goes back quite a bit earlier than that.
I don't think you could have had the 1920s marches and political movements led by blind people if you didn't have this slow burn from the 19th century.
And a slow burn is what it continued to be. Most of the small improvements in the situation of disabled people in the first two-thirds of the 20th century were top-down, coming either as a side effect of the welfare state or from the benevolence of still very paternalistic charities. It wasn't until the late 1960s and early 70s that we see beginnings of anything which could be called a disability rights movement in the wake of the civil rights movements in the United States. For me, the excitement of this series has been to discover the evidence that such a drive for equality has always been there. It's a discovery which has excited Selina Mills too, encountering that early 19th century French woman, Adèle Husson.
I've been reading history and thinking, oh, these people are nothing to do with me. And suddenly here's a woman who really is a voice from the past who has something to do with me. It made me feel that I was part of a history of going blind women or blind women. I'm partially sighted at the moment, but it made me understand that I wasn't alone, so to speak, in history. She's very good at her own identity. I mean, she's very strong. And so you sort of feel, well, OK, I can be strong too.
And what's interesting is that for me, brought up in a blind school as someone who was born blind, with the one exception of Louis Braille, I don't think I heard of any blind people. I don't think I heard of my history. In fact, I didn't think we had one. So that is quite interesting to hear you say that.
I think, actually, that's very interesting because I think it's giving a narrative structure to people's lives. And I think once you own a narrative structure, it becomes part of your identity. And I think for disabled people, that has changed phenomenally in the last 5 years, the stories that are being told. And they're much more mainstream, they're much more public. So it becomes part of history in general, rather than sort of other and separate. It's become far more integrated.
What we can't know is whether that new respect for difference is a permanent trend or just another cycle we're going through. What's fascinated me and taught me most in making this series is the challenge to the idea that attitudes to disability have grown progressively more enlightened. The realisation, for instance, that you may have been better off in a medieval monastery than in a Victorian workhouse, that the flowering of scientific knowledge in the 18th century didn't lead to the growth of tolerance to physical difference, and the fact that there have always been voices speaking out against patronising and demeaning attitudes to disabled people. But most importantly of all, hearing these lost voices should remind us that generalisations about disability, as about everything else, condemn us to misunderstanding and inaccuracy. Disability doesn't make us good or bad, pathetic or brave. It just makes us human.